Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today I have a special guest, Rei Murasame. Today we're going to talk about the mess of modern world affairs and Trumpism and protectionism and this mess with Canada, Iraq, well, not Iraq, Iran, Syria. Yeah, yeah. You want to break it all down, bring up the speed. Um,
Yeah, it's good to be here.
yeah.
I mean, compared to previous ground that I've been on, this is a lot less hostile than usual. I mean, usually I'm having to raise my voice at a bunch of people in like 5 versus 1 or 7 versus 1 arguments, somehow having to hold my own. Whereas here, I think it's a more relaxed conversation we'll be having.
I'm a pretty chill guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we just jump right in, right? I mean, where do we even start with this? I mean, we saw what happened today. I mean, we could start with the G7.
Yeah. Trump throwing all trade with G7 countries.
Or whatever it is that he said, because you can never be too sure what Trump actually meant when he said anything, right? And so I'm just gonna just read verbatim from this BBC article, and then you can tell me when to stop. So apparently, and this just happened, I guess, within the last hour. So I guess you and I are now finding out about this at the same time as we're talking about it, which is pretty interesting. So I guess our listeners will get to see how fast we are on our feet.
Yeah.
Quote, all G7 nations have agreed at their summit in Canada on the importance of a rules-based trading system, despite tensions with the US. The joint statement signed by US President Donald Trump and his counterparts comes amid a row over high US tariffs imposed this month on steel and aluminium imports. The EU and Canada have taken steps to retaliate. Mr. Trump says tariffs are needed to reverse America's trade deficit. Well, okay. Soon after the joint statement was announced, the US president tweeted defiantly about not allowing other countries to impose, quote, impose massive tariffs and trade barriers on its farmers, workers, and companies. The G7 summit held in Lamay, Quebec province, also covered such issues as relations with Russia. What was agreed? In the communiqué announced by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the group of major industrial nations, Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Japan, and Germany, agreed on the need for free, fair, and mutually beneficial trade and the importance of fighting protectionism. Quote, we strive to reduce tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and subsidies, they said. When asked about President Trump's earlier comments on trade, in which he warned his allies of imposing retaliatory measures for the tariffs, Mr. Trudeau told reporters, quote, the president will continue to say what he says on various occasions. He continued, what we did this weekend was come together and roll up our sleeves and figure out consensus language that we could all agree to on a broad range of issues. What else did Trump have to say? President Trump earlier told reporters that he had proposed the idea of a tariff-free G7 to other leaders and described his talks with them as, quote, extremely productive. The United States has been taken advantage of for decades and decades, he continued, describing America as, quote, a piggy bank that everyone keeps robbing, end quote. President Trump said retaliation tariffs from his allies were, quote, a mistake, and warned that if it got as far as a trade war, then the US would, quote, win that war 1,000 times out of 1,000, end quote. He left the summit early to travel to Singapore for a landmark meeting with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to try to persuade him to give up the country's nuclear weapons. What are the tariffs? On the 1st of June, the US imposed a 25% tariff for steel and a 10% for aluminium on imports from the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. Mr. Trump said the move would, quote, protect domestic producers that were vital to US security. The EU then announced tariffs on US goods, ranging from Harley-Davidson motorcycles to Bourbon. Canada and Mexico are also taking action in retaliation. So Trump's price, and this is analysis by Jessica Murphy. The US president has made it clear he believes the removal of tariffs against his G7 allies should come at a price, and he doesn't expect the US to pick up the tab. His statements on the sidelines of the contentious G7 summit come just weeks after his administration slapped metal tariffs on Canada, the EU, and Mexico, who quickly announced their own retaliatory measures. Sticking points also remain in the North American Free Trade Agreement negotiations between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, despite it being a key topic in the bilateral meeting between Mr. Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The American leader said a three-country deal would only be possible with substantial changes and reiterated his interest instead in forming a separate two-way trade accords with Mexico and Canada, an interest Canada has made clear it does not share. While the consensus-based G7 might well agree on the benefits of both free and fair trade between economic allies, it appears that could look like it's still up for debate. What is the, well, I don't need to read this part. They're going to explain what is the G7. I mean, just in case anyone doesn't know, it is an annual summit bringing together Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Japan, and Germany, which represent more than 60% of global net worth between them. Economics tops the agenda, although the meetings now always branch off to cover major global issues. Russia was suspended from the group in 2014 because of its annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. On Friday, Mr. Trump made a surprise call for Moscow to be readmitted, but German Chancellor Angela Merkel said other members were against the idea, and then everyone proceeded to ignore him.
So, so you think it's just power projection, power play on Trump's part? After all, he is a populist and have a base appeal anyway.
No, there's an explanation for this. There is an explanation for why this is happening now. Although this is going to be a summary, I guess, and then I guess we're going to be talking more about it as we go along. But I think from their perspective, like if you get inside Trump's head, whatever might be in there, we can only guess because obviously Shinzo Abe tried to get inside of his head in 2016 and wasn't able to actually find anything. But you know, if you were to imagine that it were possible to find something inside Trump's head as to why he's doing these things, and why Navarro does these things, and why his advisors such as Wilbur Ross and what's that other guy's name?
No idea.
Stephen Miller.
Okay.
And the others, what they're thinking about. I mean, they believe that Western idealism, they believe Western idealism has become unmanageable, right? And so we've heard about admonitions against trying to export the Western model to the rest of the world through war. And then we've also heard from the right, specifically from the alt-right and from sort of, paleo-conservatives, a desire for a world where the US can somehow free itself from the shackles of a rules-based order, the very same rules-based order that Trump was asked to sign up for, again, in that communique at the G7, that he really didn't want to sign because he's retracted it now. I see here on one of my notifications that Trump has actually denounced the communique that he himself had signed just an hour earlier. So I guess it kind of confirms these notes then. So yes, he wants to free himself from the shackles of a rules-based order, and it wants to exercise its position as being the most powerful country in the world, right?
Right.
So usually you would think that this liberal world order would be in America's interest, which I guess it has been since 1945, right? But there is a viewpoint that's coming forward that it is not necessarily the case, because in this rules-based order, you end up with rising powers that are still developing and countries that are having economic specialization and are getting in on comparative advantage and take quote unquote taking the jobs and so on. All of that is becoming really inconvenient, and so I think for some people in the US, they were quite happy to assert a liberal rules-based order when they were the most powerful country, bar none, because then you can kind of you can just lean back on that and you're fine, right? But as soon as it came down to the existence of competition, there's nothing that they hate more than actual competition, which is why now you see them retracting these positions slowly but surely.
I'll go like due to the liberal international order, Americans has the highest standard of livings and have client states all over the world. So on their way.
Yeah, so you would think it would be good enough, but people fight most viciously when there's a relative loss of power rather than an absolute loss of economic power. So I mean, they're still the richest country in the world, but there is a feeling that they've lost relative power in terms of what percentage of the economy the United States comprises. For instance, in 1945, how much of the world economy did the United States economy comprise? I actually don't know the answer to this offhand, so that's an actual question. It's a very large percentage, though, right?
I would imagine, well, since European infrastructure was totally destroyed, so maybe.
Yeah, and pretty much most of Asia, Southeast Asia, was completely destroyed also. Then, yes, you would expect that to be a very massive percentage, right? And since we know that
80%, 85%.
I don't. That might be a bit high, but I mean, it was significant. Let's say 65. Let's guess 65, right? In fact, hold on. I can probably check that to find it out. Give me a second.
Okay.
Maybe I actually have the answer to that question in front of me. Give me 1 second. There's a quotation for this as well. I'm sure I have a quotation for this. I hope you're also checking for this percentage.
Um, Navarro got the policy game too late. China cannot even devalue against the U.S. land speed.
Aha, found it. 1947. So I'm just going to quote from George F. Kennan.
True, that, yeah, that. He's an
Yeah, so
interesting fellow.
yeah, a memo he wrote in 1948. So I'm just going to quote, and he's describing the United States here. Quote, it is urgently necessary that we recognize our own limitations as a moral and ideological force among the Asiatic peoples. Our political philosophy and our passions for living have very little applicability to masses of people in Asia. They may be all right for us, with our highly developed political traditions running back into the centuries and with our peculiarly favorable geographic position, but they are simply not practical or helpful today for most of the people in Asia. This being the case, we must be very careful when we speak of exercising leadership in Asia. We are deceiving ourselves and others when we pretend to have the answers to the problems which agitate many of these Asiatic peoples. And this is the important part now. Furthermore, and again, this is 1948. Furthermore, we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction.
Very astute observation from Mr. Kenneman. Very interesting fellow.
Yeah, and I kind of think that the US is going back to that viewpoint because obviously they ignored him for quite a while, as you can tell.
Well, he's the one that came up with the policy of containment and later became a rather harsh critic of every
Everything, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like this particular passage has really come back to the fore because they're doing it again, but in the sense that it's a desire, but it hasn't actually manifested yet. Because you do get the impression that they would like to have that influence because economic power produces political power, right? And so if you have 50% of the world's wealth, your power is immense. However, if you're down to, say, 20% or 15% of the world's wealth, that doesn't necessarily mean you're poorer. It just means that other people became wealthier. However, that decreased your relative power, your relative standing in the world, and that is, I believe, what they're fighting for.
Also,
behind all of the
sorry.
claims that they're hard done by or that the jobs have been destroyed and things like this. I don't think that's actually what they're upset about because they are still the richest country in the world.
Also, Lansby stated that the U.S. grew because of the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was going to collapse anyway, but that's a different story.
And so we're also seeing these real punches between Donald Trump and Trudeau. I mean, Trump seems to be really focused on Trudeau. Why do you think that is, in your opinion?
Let's see, Trudeau, the locale. Let's see. No idea. For the most part, I can tell. U.S. and the U.S. relation between Canada has been rather reciprocal, and just I don't know what's the complete 180 is. But you said before we start, you mentioned something about the pipelines. Well, or I probably shouldn't say pipelines, but something's happening in the Arctic. You know.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of Arctic activity going on. But I mean, you have to look at the history of Canada to understand why Trudeau is the way that he is, and why Trump is reacting to him in this way. If you think about the West as the North Atlantic, and you think of it as a unified ruling class that exists in the North Atlantic that has existed since since the foundation of the European Union, really, right? So the European Coal and Steel Pact, not the European Union itself, right? Around that time period, you had to bring together all of these groups in order to face the Soviet Union, and at that time, there was a lot of reorganization that was going on, and so you have to understand Trudeau's role in that context. And so I called him before we started the stream. I said I'm going to claim that Trudeau is a necessary lolcow, right? which is kind of a funny way of putting it. But yeah, Trudeau is a necessary lolcow. The way that he behaves, how he's very nice and he presents himself as as a very affable guy. He has very, very good social policies that everyone can get along with. Like he's very inoffensive in the way that he behaves. It's because he saves his political capital for the things that really matter. So all this cute Trudeau theatre is a necessary deception because Canada's global strategy could not continue without it. It's been 150 years since Canada was created as a self-governing federal state, and this was galvanized by tensions between the US and the UK, because obviously Canada was a dominion of the United Kingdom before it had its relationship with the United States, as you know. The purpose of the creation of Canada was to build up a productive base from which to expand into what's now called Western Canada and to have the resources there. In 1914, Canada's ruling class played a very significant role in the First World War, not as Britain's dog, but as a power in their own right. Canada's greatest economic expansions have been during warfare, where Canada's geography, location, and resources played key roles. As Trudeau has once said before, quote, "The reason that the world pays heed to Canada is because we fought like lions in theatres and conflicts around the globe." During the 1960s, Canada had to then rebrand itself as a compassionate power so as to recapture the allegiance of restless youth and workers, because, of course, you know how the 1960s was. Yeah. So that was when Pierre Trudeau first entered the scene. The father, of course. And his domestic record, which I think everyone listening already knows anyway, along with the creation of CSIS and a closer alignment with US strategy, was what they were engaged in. And the reason they had to do that was because if they had not engaged in that reorganization, Canadian workers might have slipped out of Canadian national control and been vulnerable to machinations of the USSR. Because during that time period, competing for power was about essentially how can you provide for workers in such a way that they're not going to think, well, we might have a better shot if we went with the Soviets or something. You see what I mean? Yeah. So this then resulted in the crafting of the kind of Canadian state that exists now that libertarians love to make fun of because, it has, decent social services and so on and so forth. I don't have to elaborate on that.
Yeah.
So goes on. And so especially when Russian active measures is active, it's really essential for Trudeau to essentially maintain this position. And so it's kind of like, you could call it Canadian imperialism with a smiley mask, right? I mean, would they be fair to call it that?
Yeah, I think it's fair. But on the libertarian...
They're part of NATO.
On the libertarian bit, the reason why libertarians don't like Canada that much, despite being like number 7 by the Heritage Foundation thing, libertarians just have a very natural disgust for the European model, which Canada embraced when Pierre Trudeau came into power.
And which his son is now continuing.
Yeah.
Also, all of that is being done for the reason because of the fact that Arctic geopolitics is becoming interesting now. So, there's an Arctic strategy value for Russia. Dmitry Medvedev signed in 2008 a strategy paper saying that the polar region will become Russia's main strategic resource base by the year 2020. Now, of course, who borders the polar region? Well, I mean, other than Russia, which is the entirety of the Baltics, right?
Yeah.
And to some extent, the United Kingdom. And Canada, right? So this all makes complete sense. And if you understand Trump as being kind of like, a little bit compromised by Russia, you can see why he'd be picking on Trudeau and trying to undermine and generally mess with Canada's strategy.
So
now, of course, some people may be thinking, well, why is this important to me? It's because of the fact that Russia doesn't actually produce anything of worth for anyone. If you actually look at Russia's economy, the entire thing is essentially just cronyism, right? Like, I mean, what do you think of Russia's economy? Diversifying into what, though?
I have no idea. I just heard their economy is just diversifying. I know that's one. I just heard that that was one of Putin's promises during his re-election. Well, it wasn't really wasn't a re-election, but a sham.
A reselection. You should just call it the selection. He reselected himself, and then afterwards, he came out with these promises. No. I mean, I can't see where this would be. Like, I mean, in my view, letting Russia camp out atop people's resources only seems to result in everyone having to pay Russian oligarchs rent. They're just the biggest and most inefficient, corrupt rentier entity in the world. I mean, how would I describe Russia? Like, if I could describe it in a single sentence, I think it would be something like, they create nothing, they own.
Let's see. I describe Russia as I don't actually. There's a real. I think you should check out my talk with a guy called Kurt Dulo on my channel. He just broadened my perspective on Russia like a lot.
Be interesting to have a debate with him then. Was he pro-Russian?
Let's see. He's not. I don't think he's pro-Russia by any sense. I think he likes Putin because he's really effective, really efficient.
Yeah, he's a very efficient thief.
No, like the thing is, hey, he trying to. The thing is, when Russia, the thing is, like from his perspective, Russia faced like really bad civilizational collapse back in the 1990s, and he viewed Putin trying. He kind of just viewed Putin as a guy who's just trying to do everything in power to prevent that happening. They tried. Well, democracy ended up to be a horrible failure during the 1990s. So yeah, he sort of just viewed Putin as a stabilizing force in Russia. Anyway.
Well, if we go to the issue of these tariffs, anyway, I mean, these ones that Trump is bringing. There's the question of that I saw in USA Today, where the question asked, should we let his voters just get what they asked for? Like at this point, is the only way to make the child stop touching the hot stove to essentially just let them actually come into full contact with it. Or as they wrote in the article, how many times do you tell someone not to touch a hot stove before you stand aside and let them do what they want? This is a question experts in Congress now face when arguing with people who seem bent on hurting themselves by supporting President Trump's policies, especially his trade policies. It's possible that the president is right. No, there isn't. There's no possibility. And that what America needs is a vicious trade war with its closest allies. History and experience, to say nothing of common sense, however, suggests that is wrong. So, I'm looking for the paragraph here. Quote, and sure enough, some of Trump's voters, like farmers, small businesses that want special exemptions, are already squawking, because the people most likely to be hurt by this kind of recklessness are the very people who voted for Trump. So, I mean, should we allow, essentially just stop interrupting the opposition while it makes a mistake?
Can you say that again?
Because these things will backfire. Like, these tariffs that they've imposed are going to backfire. Why should we continue to try to interrupt them while they're making these mistakes? Like, I mean, they even put tariffs on intermediate goods. They're not even doing it in a way that makes common sense.
Tariffs. All because Trump got a base appeal in the Rust Belt.
Yeah. Instead of just cutting them loose, he decided that was going to be his passport to power, and now he's stuck with it.
Yeah. Just all of it will ultimately prove to be counterproductive in the long run because these tariffs by left paradox standards are poorly designed.
Also,
paradox economist standards.
Also, you may disagree with me on this, but I actually think that libertarians have had a real problem actually getting to grips with how this could have occurred, because their theory of political economy is different from everyone else's.
Yeah,
for example, I mean, what do you think happened in order to have Trump be where he is, from a libertarian perspective? I mean, I guess you guys would say that it's like the same thing as usual, which is that basically cronies did cronyist things, and then democracy caused it to happen.
Let's see. Libertarians sort of just have that. There's a famous quote by H.L. Mencken. Let's see. Pretty describes the libertarian view on this matter. Let me bring this up. Also, this quote is kind of really witty. It's kind of funny, honestly.
Okay, go on.
Okay. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represent more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last. The White House will be occupied by a downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron.
Downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron. That is great, actually.
Yeah, just
I
on
mean,
a
he really
libertarian.
has. He really has actually come to embody all of their neuroses.
Let's see. I don't know. With libertarians, or more so the libertarians at the Mises Institute, people like Lou Rockwell and Rothbard, they probably have a really mixed reaction when it comes to Trump because, well, for one, they advocated for right wing populism during the 1990s, and just it's just a really confused reaction because they like Trump because they be subverting the media and just subverting a lot of things that libertarians despise in this status world that we're living in, but at the same time, they just sort of just view him as a crony, a New York liberal. Just it's really confused, honestly.
Hmm. And so
Yeah.
I would say that you have to. It's almost like you would have to go right back to the beginning and like get an entire theory of just how the world works to then understand how all of these things could happen. So, I mean, one thing that I often get from libertarians is kind of like, not you, but obviously other libertarians I've told you before, it's kind of like these plaintive questions of like, oh, why don't the rulers behave in the way that we think they should? Why do they have to do these things, right? Is everyone stupid? Are people in power all retarded? This kind of thing, right? But it's because government looks like it's omnipotent from afar, but it's not the way that it seems. When you take government and use it to act, the government also acts upon you, right? As
Just
soon as you actually take office, the forces which begin to act on you are different from the ones before you began to take office, right? And then the role of government is not to actually take actions itself, but to get others to act on its behalf using economic incentives. Or it's kind of like saying the king needs an army and someone has to run it.
let's see. Let's see. I think from a more Hoppian perspective, it's always about just incentives, just for giving the right incentives to the right kind of people and
Hmm.
giving democracy incentivizes short term boundary and
Yeah. But I mean,
just
do you accept though that the Hoppian position leads ultimately to a dictatorship because the number of people who are your key supporters are culled down to a very small number? Because in,
dictatorship.
in, in Hoppian conception, you don't have the entirety of civil society that you're beholden to at that point. You're beholden only to the people who you selected.
That sounds not sure about that, but it just seemed
Yeah,
like
because if he's saying that there's going to be no democracy, then you'll have a very small number of keys to power, right? A dozen generals, bureaucrats, and perhaps regional leaders.
then that's an oligarchy then, like something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. You end up with a sort of privatized oligarchy, right? And then of course you end up with the problem you have with government immediately, which is if you displease them, they will replace you.
Well, with Hoppe, he wants decentralized political units. Well, more accurately, in his terminology, community covenants, social orders. You know,
Hmm.
it's basically that it is a community. You have to agree with the set of rules. It could be a libertarian. It's more accurately a conservative social order because he's more of a libertarian conservative in that sense.
Hmm.
So that's why you get the memes like physical removal. It means like if you're a bum, unproductive, dishonest society, the people in the neighborhood will shun you, eventually kick you out from their social order or whatever. This honestly, this kind of just happens all the time. You just don't really think about it that much.
Hmm. Well, what if you condensed it and looked at it from the other way around, right? Which is to look at it from the perspective of almost like if you looked at it from the perspective of corporate power, for example, that you should make sure that your economic activity is generated and distributed to you for all of your hard work and for the key supporters need to keep your position. And so if you think about it from the perspective of governance, it's all about figuring out how best to raise and distribute resources so as not to topple the house of cards on which your hegemony is based. So if you're Hopper, for example, and you're, I guess, an aspiring benevolent dictator, right?
Yeah.
Benevolent dictator, you're trying to help your citizens, quote unquote, your influence over the the way that that social order runs attracts rivals, and so you have to keep the people who support you loyal. But there's only so much GDP you have and only so much distribution you can do. So every bit of treasure that you spend on citizens is treasure not spent on shoring up people's loyalty. And so you see the problem here. This will develop ultimately into an oligarchy because you're going to eventually have to pay people not to revolt against you.
So it's just gonna look like Mobug patchworks.
Or Vladimir Putin's state. And this is the thing where I'm pessimistic on this.
Wait. It could look like the since Hopper's German. It could look like those competing princely states when Germany was decentralized. You ever thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, those are very similar things, but that's also a very old social order, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean, that's not very modern at all. Something older than they might like to admit. The other thing that causes the expansion of power as well is that we talk about these key supporters, but being a key to that person's power is also itself a position of power. So they too have to watch out for rivals from below or above. And so the resources which they have must also be spent in a way that maintains their position, which means that then cronies have other cronies.
I see what you.
And so you see how this works. You end up with a web of power that is being created. How is it described in Russia? Because you described it just earlier, where they said that the democracy quote unquote failed, and they ended up having to reconstruct something else instead. I mean, what you described is called the vertical of power, right? Where you end up with cronies supporting other cronies who also have cronies, who also in turn have cronies.
That's pretty smart what you do there. You're flipping all the criticism back on hobbies. That's pretty smart. That's really smart. Just like what you just said reminded me of a quote. Basically, in one of the passages in Democracy, the guy that failed, he said, "Once entry barrier to government is allowed, and when way humanity is what it is, always coveting other people's properties, democracy essentially just leads up to more parasitism." Basically, he said in the end that no one is ultimately safe under a democracy.
Well, I'm going to make the argument that actually you are safer in that scenario than you would be in Hopper's ideal society, because of the fact that the narrow range of people in this vertical of power system means that everyone else becomes dispensable. Because think about it, if you're not in on the the loyalty factor, then how are you important to them in any way? This is why they're able to cut social services to the bone and things like this as well. Because when you have only a narrow section of supporters and no actual democracy, you can cut just about anything because of the fact that you're not obligated to those people in order to keep your power position anymore. So you end up with a more, I guess you call it, quote, efficient government, but it's not necessarily one that produces the best outcome for most of the people.
Yes.
Because there's no incentive. There's no incentive. Like, if you don't have an incentive to get into office to please at least, I guess, a wide swathe of the population, if you only have to please 4 people in order to hold your position, then you can imagine what that country might look like.
Look like Eastern Europe and Russia.
Yeah, basically. So you end up with that problem. And it's surprising that no one who's read Hopper or any of the others surrounding him, such as Walter Block and others like this, have actually pointed out this problem.
Actually, someone else did point that problem. Yeah.
Who was it?
A guy who was on my channel 2 weeks ago.
Oh dear. Well, I hadn't listened to that person, so I hope that we haven't literally overlapped each other on every point.
Let's see. He basically pointed out that Rothbard libertarianism will look like the gallows of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, he got it exactly. He got it almost exactly where I was going to go then.
Yeah. So yeah. So the thing
in contrast, you have the representative democracy model, right? And so you have power being divided among many people. It's taken allegedly not by force, quote unquote, even though it really is, but with words, meaning that you get thousands or millions of citizens to like you on election day, then you can get into power. Except obviously, I'm sure we've both heard this quote before. It's one about how democracy is how to have a civil war without actually killing anyone.
Isn't America kind of like that? Because it's very clientelistic, similar to Russia. It's still kind of well, it's corrupt. It's just we're just wealthy, so just sort of just high.
I
Maybe
s- no, no. I think the United States was always more pluralistic than Russia was. It's only recently in 2016, and then probably before that. But I think it's only recently it started an accelerated convergence where it's starting to look more and more like actually Russia.
but it just seemed like given if you look back in the 19th century, you have people like Mark Twain just complaining how really corrupt Washington was. Because and it seemed like things haven't changed that much, but things just become more transparent. Just United States was one of the first states that invented clientelism. Just
Mm.
not one of the first states. It's just you just don't notice it because we got a bunch of resources.
Another thing I'd say as well is that it's all a matter of compared to what, because the United States is still better. I mean, or at least it was until recently. I should say, let's take a neutral year. Let's say it's the year 1999. The United States in the year 1999 was still one of the best places to live on planet Earth, right? I mean, we agree on that.
Yeah, just
Yeah, and so relatively speaking, there could have been worse. And this is another point which I want to get in on libertarians here as well, where they talk about where they claim that democracy leads to higher taxes. Is this something that you guys agree? That you guys believe? All of you uniformly?
pretty much yes.
Okay, why do you all believe this?
We all believe this because democracy is inherently centralizing. It's a very centralizing force. And it requires, due to trying to subsidize the lower middle classes, the unproductive classes, the so-called parasites, it will eventually lead to more wealth redistribution, more inflation. So more inflation, basically devaluing the productive members of society.
Okay. So yeah, I get where you're going with this. I feel like
it's kind of Darwinian.
yeah, I kind of feel like your view on this, you don't intend to do things which are bad to people in this case. It's just that there's a fact which I believe sincerely, like this is not like a talking point or something. There's a fact where I sincerely believe that you're overlooking here. And so I'm just going to explain to you, then you tell me what you think of it after I get to the end, right? And so if you're sitting comfortably in democracy, which I guess you are, right? And people are getting tax rebates and there are people who don't pay income tax and so on, right? So that is in fact bringing the average tax rate down. The idea that people are getting tax rebates and there are 47% of people that don't pay any federal income taxes in your country and stuff like this, right? Now you're thinking, well, what about in a semi-feudal conservative dictatorship, for example? Is the tax even lower than it is in the US presently? I would say no. And the reason for this is because there's a difference between actual taxation versus taxation that we wrote down on paper and presented to you. Now, I'll explain what I mean by this. Dictatorships, or at least semi-feudal dictatorships specifically, often forego tax paperwork in favor of just taking the wealth from people directly. For example, it's common for a semi-feudal state to force farmers to sell their produce to the state for little and then turn around and sell that produce on the open market, pocketing the difference at a massively high equivalent tax rate. Now, technically, that's not recorded as a tax, but it is a tax, right?
Sound like rent sinking, to be honest.
Indeed. Now imagine, because many libertarians will look at me and say, well, you invoked the state here. Maybe we just don't have the state do it. Okay, so what happens if you're in a semi-feudal state in which everything has been privatized into the hands of landlords who operate in the free market? And then the landlord extracts from the peasant the equivalent of a 90% tax by simply taking the produce off of them and then selling it at a higher price and pocketing the difference. You see what I mean there? And so you end up with a, quote, free market, small state, semi-feudal system in which your actual real effective tax rate can be something higher than 90% because of the fact that landlords have done it instead. So they've simply privatized the task of collecting your taxation and called it rent. And you're thinking, and some of you might be thinking, well, where has this ever happened? Nepal. This happened in Nepal up to about 2006, where they were taking 90% of people's wealth away in rent each time until people finally rose up and overthrew it. But what were they overthrowing? They were not really overthrowing a gigantic state in the sense that people usually understand it. It was a very distributed form of oppression because it was distributed in the form of landlords backed by the state, which was a small government state.
So, under a hypothetical libertarian order, you think
Yeah,
it
why? Yeah, that's the question I'm asking. Why would a libertarian order not become the exact kind of semi-feudal arrangement I just described, where they very cunningly say, okay, well, our tax rate is very, very low, but we're recouping all of that as rent instead because we've just decided to call it rent?
well, I probably would just say that. Me personally, I probably just say the point. I think libertarianism needs to be reformed in a very serious way because I think Rothbardianism is very suicidal in its ethics and what it's advocate for. And Hoppe did what he can by restating what Rothbard saying in stronger, more philosophical language. Well, Hoppe is more of a continental philosopher, rather. He was trained by Marxists, but don't tell the libertarians that. But just, I think the point of libertarianism is to form sovereignty, something similar to the English, or something similar to basically forming a nation state, a conservative nation state that's really efficient. Something similar to early America, or something similar to England back in the day.
Hmm.
It's instead of just focusing on more of the abstract criticism of the state, because they start with nonviolence, which is a mistake in my eyes. I'm thinking is it needs to be reformed. You say I start with violence. This is my framework. It's basically saying why I shouldn't kill you and take your stuff. And I think libertarians start with that framework, basically forming a group, a collective mindset. And what people do, essentially, people take and steal. That's the state of nature. The state of nature is anarchic, and people will do anything to get out of anarchy.
Yeah,
So,
and it's also a matter of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. Because let's say you're the Taliban, which you're not, but let's pretend you're the Taliban for a moment here. Taliban thinking is actually very short-term thinking, because what they do is they sit down there and say, okay, they're going to have a non-representative system. Therefore, since they don't have to please the crowd, there's no incentive to cut rents or taxes, right? Effective taxes, I mean, because obviously when you're under the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan system, you're essentially just paying tax as rent, really. So we continue on that basis. They have no incentive to lower that, or they had no incentive to lower that because of the fact that they didn't have to please a crowd. There was no democratic election for anyone to demand that you need to cut these taxes down, right? And because of that, they had less educated citizens anyway, because the kind of social order they were running was extremely extractive, right? So you end up with a very uneducated, unfree, and thus unproductive social order, which means less wealth for everyone, including those who are in the ruling position. And then they get overthrown in the end anyway, because someone can attack them from outside because they're actually very weak outside of their own borders, right? Okay, so what's the long-term thinking? Proper long-term thinking is if you have a more broader base of people you have to appeal to, then cutting taxes becomes a crowd pleaser. Because if everyone has to cast a vote to decide who they're going to vote for, they're obviously going to vote for the person who's going to reduce their taxation, right? And so you're going to have progressive taxation introduced. You're going to see reduction of taxes on poor people. You have people appealing directly to poor people and claiming that you can have more education, more freedom, and a greater productivity. This then results in more productivity overall, which then results in a greater payout for everyone because GDP has increased. However, this requires very long-term thinking. Now, my problem, other than the problems I've already mentioned, with the entire libertarian paradigm is that the libertarian paradigm puts you back into the position where you're incentivized to not bother to do any of that. Under libertarianism, what is the incentive to actually reduce rents for working people?
libertarians are mid time horizon people. They're mid horizon people, while conservatives are more long horizon people. I think libertarians need to be refraining saying that we need to form a nation state or just a centralized authority that protects us from external outreach, from external forces. Then taxation becomes a necessary evil then to fund that defense. Then then we can talk about providing subsidizing the poor so they won't revolt to start a some type of revolution or whatever. Um, just I think it needs to be reformed that way so libertarian arguments can be much more coherent and stronger.
Exactly. I noticed this a lot as well. Like, people saying that they understand our arguments also. They'll often come and say, okay, well, you're talking about, idealism or angels or people who have good feelings. No, I often say this, and I'm going to repeat it here as well. The reason why we build universities and hospitals and roads and grant freedom to people is not because we're actually good people, but rather because it increases citizen productiveness.
Well, I'm not much of a fan of the European model of public service.
And the reason why the reason why quote democracies are better places to live than semi-feudal zones is not because the representatives are better people, but rather because their needs just so happen to be aligned with a larger portion of the population.
What about semi-feudal zone? You mean like a state inside a state kind of thing? Like
like localism, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that broadens things as well, right? It can also be affected by the way that the Earth is interacting with these people as well. So, for example, if the wealth of a nation is mostly dug out of the ground, it's probably going to be a terrible place to live. And why is this? Because, for example, a coal mine can run on nothing but dying slaves and still produce coal that you want, right? Oil is a little bit different. Foreign companies extract and refine it without any citizen involvement, for example. You could actually have that happen. And with any citizens who are outside of that cycle, they could actually be ignored while the government is rewarding itself, and all of its supporters and key power elements are kept loyal. And so we end up living in a kind of a weird world right now, where basically the smartest democracies are stable, the worst dictatorships are stable, and in between there's what you could call the valley of revolution. So, for example, the resource-rich dictator will build roads only from his ports to the resources and from their palace to the airport, and people stay quiet, not because that's fine or because they're scared, but because the cold truth is that starving, disconnected illiterates don't make very good revolutionaries. And this is why it is so key to come up with an idea of how do you overcome this, because that's crucial for global development, which is what we've actually been talking about all along anyway, right? How do you overcome this starving, disconnected illiterates? How do you overcome people being like that? And the way to do this is you have to have an uprising which is capable of reaching out to the broad majority. And you can't do that if you're going to come in and say, okay, well, we're going to actually open Hopper's book and say, okay, how do we appeal to the least number of people? For example, libertarianism could never save Afghanistan. Libertarianism could not save Pakistan.
Rothbardian libertarianism is ghetto ethics. So
yeah, it's almost like it's almost like you're taking ghetto ethics to an actual ghetto and expecting not to have a ghetto at the end of it.
So yeah, it's just gonna look like the ghettos in Eastern Europe. So yeah. So,
and then, of course, you have the other fragile people in the middle as well. I mean, think about Bashar al-Assad, for example. If you want to call him, say, a middling government without any resources, quote, without any resources, and I place very big air quotes around that, they had to take a large amount of wealth directly from poor farmers and factory workers. So 2 roads won't do. He has to maintain some minimum of life for the citizens, right? But keeping the workforce somewhat connected and somewhat educated and somewhat healthy, therefore makes them more able to revolt. So it's almost like it's like they say in the manuals on counterinsurgency, right? That just when the economic situation is starting to improve, that's when you're actually most unstable. Okay. Because people have enough connections and enough knowledge and enough ability to understand how to revolt or to have a revolution on the one hand, depending on how you look at it, but not enough that they're satisfied with what they have.
Okay. From a more
I'm just gonna say that I don't know if any libertarians like you or any other libertarians want to tell me there's something wrong here, but I can't see how in any of these three scenarios that I described, why bringing libertarianism into it would make the situation any better than it already is.
thing about libertarianism is, well, libertarians with a small L, not any specific strand of libertarianism, is it needs to build a high trust society, a basically very strong social credit. That should be the goal of libertarianism or libertarians, to build a very strong social foundation that it won't turn into the ghettos of Eastern Europe or the oligarchy of modern day Russia. It should never be the goal of that. That's the thing. That's the problem that you figured out with Rothbard a long time ago. That he was inadvertently restating the ethics of the ghettos, essentially, in more cozy language than that. But I think it should be a goal just to create a high trust society, but it takes a very, very long time. I think the most ideal state is probably Denmark. It's probably Denmark. It's high trust, culturally homogeneous, and just pretty much a good place to live.
Mm. But I mean, you saw what Denmark did when it entered the ERM, right? Where they had to go through the usual requirements that the European Union asks of you, which is to create a systematic form of bargaining between labor and capital, right? That, I think, in addition to the fact that Denmark has one of the tightest labor markets in Europe, those two things together probably do a lot to help Denmark remain as stable and high trust as it presently is.
Yes.
And people often don't give credit to those things. Like, the European Union should be partially credited for Denmark's stability.
Yes. Thing is, that's the ideal state, but libertarians start with, they start in the middle, like many Marxists, rationalists, they just start in the middle of the analysis and go from there, but they don't look back. They don't look back of the bigger picture here.
Yeah. They don't ask, how did we get here exactly?
I think proprietarians like Kurt Dula would say that the aristocracy wasn't oppressive, but domesticate has a decimating effect on the middle and lower classes. He believes that the upper classes are not oppressive, but more a civilizing effect. I think you two probably have very strong disagreement with that.
Yeah, that's not always true.
Well,
I would definitely say that's not always true.
He likes the English monarchy because they were able to balance. The English aristocracy was very balanced, from my understanding. Just the absolute monarchies of France, Spain. This just sort of made their country significantly weaker, while England was sort of stable for the time being. Yes.
I mean, also when they criticize the so-called European model, which is actually not a European model, by the way. Well, I'll get to that in a second. When they criticize it, they're not actually thinking about the fact that it was created during the time that they were facing the Soviet Union. I think the entirety of Europe would have probably fallen to the Soviet Union if it hadn't been for the Marshall Plan and for the things that followed after that.
So, wealth redistribution, save Europe.
Yeah, all of that. And I'll explain to you. I'll try to explain now. I mean, one of the key components of the Marshall Plan, insofar as you should see this as seamlessly leading into the creation, ultimately, of the European Coal and Steel Pact, right? One of the key components of the Marshall Plan was hardware deliveries. So you got technology, continuous wide strip mills for the steel industry, for example. advanced means of production which were capable of producing large quantities of cheap sheet steel for automobiles and household appliances, and thus these were instrumental in subordinating the traditionally reactionary steel industry to the system of relative surplus value production, while at the same time consolidating the subordination of the steel industry to the powerful automobile groups through cheap imports. Raising wages with these connotations required that in participating in the new mode of accumulation, the European working class had to limit itself only to economic demands. What do I mean by this? When you're talking about demands that were available at the time, they could have demanded just economic rises, which is basically just wage increases, or they could have actually had demands that were revolutionary and anti-systemic. And so what they did was they had the ruling class at the time, and various political commentators in general, would push for only economic demands, such as wage increases, increased union bargaining sessions, etc., etc. You know how these things operate. And they would say, okay, you can do that, but we are against any anti-systemic ideologies, such as deliberately importing Soviet ways of organizing. That was not allowed, right? And so in this aim, you had basically the entire Atlantic ended up having a reliance on social democratic parties as literally the enforcers of the Western order as it presently exists. Without social democracy, you would have probably lost the working class support, which is roughly about 76% of any random European country.
The middle classes.
Yeah, basically. And so people often do not give social democracy the, I guess you can call it credit, depending on which angle you look at it from, for that. But without social democracy, coming and saying that you can have rising wages and participation in unions so long as they are not oriented in a way that is conducive to Soviet gains, you would have had something quite different happening.
I think on liberal democracy in the middle class, I think the liberal democracy will ultimately fail due to the middle class, honestly.
How?
They're subjected to populism, resentment. The loss of dignity in the middle class can be very devastating.
Well, it's only a loss of dignity to be assisted by social democrats. If you have a pre-existing ideology which says to be assisted is somehow shameful.
Oh, just
if you told them there was nothing wrong with that because this is how the economy works. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. When it's down, maybe you need something. I don't think they would find it that offensive.
I mean, like the middle class needs to have a sense of dignity, a sense of identity that I identify with my nation state. I'm willing to participate in the process, kind of thing. And I think that's declining, at least in America, anyway.
Although I was about to get to that now that you mentioned that as well, this thing about the European model. This European model is not actually European anyway. It's American.
What?
It is, and I'll explain how. You're familiar with AFL and CIO, right?
No.
The two American unions, AFL and CIO.
Okay, explain.
And so yes, AFL exported its form of social organization into Western Europe. So I'll explain how. This is around 1950 something, 1952? Between 1948 and 1952, this was occurring. So I'm just going to select from what's this book called? Give me 1 second, I'm just going to read from it. The Making of an Atlantic Ruling Class by Kees van der Pijl, 1984. Right? So it was writing quite a long time ago now. So I'm just going to quote from, I think this is chapter 6 and I'm reading from, isn't it? Give me a second, let me just check what page. Yep, I'm reading from chapter 6, which is called The Martial Offensive and Capitalist Restoration in Europe. So I'm just going to start reading from the middle. German labor leaders in the United States had formed a German labor delegation in exile and obtained official recognition from the AFL. In April 1945, a Free German Trade Union Committee was launched in American-occupied Frankfurt. Due to the restrictions on political activity decreed by the Americans, this organization failed to be effective in moderating the influence of radical elements at the local and plant levels. The initial willingness of the New Dealers in OMG-US to allow radicals to support their denazification effort was soon overruled by the American business supporters of General Clay. The AFL likewise exerted its influence to thwart the grassroots democratization movement, although it took a visit of AFL Vice President Doherty to Germany to ensure that the American military authorities heeded the organization's wishes. As a result, the CIO and WFTU were denied facilities in the American zone altogether. Thus, the anti-fascist elements in the German working class and their sympathizers among the New Dealers were effectively frustrated in the early stage, but the mass basis for a moderate alternative was not yet available. To remedy this situation, individual trade union bureaucrats like Marcus Schleicher, the president of the Free Trade Union Committee in the American zone, and Blocher in the British zone, were parachuted in by the military authorities to negotiate directly with German employers. These men took the lead in propagating the American pattern of trade union organization. Oh, we're here now. Upon his return from a trip to America, Schleicher told German workers' audiences in 1948 that they should be ready to discard the traditional German idea of workers' councils. Only then could they benefit from the type of national political influence that had so impressed him on his American tour. The German labor movement's traditions could not be discarded with so easily, however, and the consolidation of economic trade unionism in Germany was forced to absorb the council idea to a considerable extent. Indeed, it was precisely in order to stave off the dangerous socialization demand of the German left that the AFL began giving qualified support to the council idea. So you can see what's happening there, that by basically creating a facsimile of what Soviet-oriented socialists wanted, the AFL was successful in actually bleeding away its support. Bear in mind, this is an American organization inside Germany I'm describing here. Eventually, the AFL formed a truly Atlantic bloc with the DGB to force the German employers' organizations and the US National Foreign Trade Council to accept the introduction of co-determination in heavy industry, and in 1952 on terms much more unfavorable to labor in the rest of the German industry. As the Marshall Plan got underway and the de facto partition of Germany became permanent, AFL intervention was also extended to supporting specific activities of the SPD, which is, of course, Germany's Social Democratic Party, the latter's undercover work in the Soviet zone. Significantly, the AFL already in 1947 had endorsed German rearmament. The predominance of the AFL over the CIO ingredient in American trade union intervention in Europe was based upon intransigent anti-communism, and this dovetailed with indigenous factors determining the resurrection of German trade union movement. The reformist tradition of the German trade unions, as well as the effectiveness of free world ideology in the partitioned country, were complemented by AFL activity, not created by it. The claim of one of the AFL organizers, David Dubinsky, that the German trade unions would have gone communist in the absence of AFL intervention was seen by them as an exaggeration, unless he meant that in the event of a series of developments linking the Greek Revolution with a Popular Front modification of one of the national coalition governments somewhere along the Mediterranean coastline, the weight of Atlantic liberal capitalism in Europe might have been critically reduced, ultimately involving Germany as well. And this might have spread to France, apparently, but I'm just going to skip along down to the end, because there's a part where the British Labour Party gets involved as well. The AFL wanted a rupture, not just with communism, but with any form of class perspective. As in Germany, the break, therefore, was not just with communism, but with indigenous working class tradition in general. The Americans sponsored avowedly Atlanticist leaderships that were ready to discard the national heritage of the labour movement. The results of this strategy varied greatly. Although hardly a weak link, American influence in the British Labour Party was reorganised and made more effective in 1947. In the autumn of that year, the editorial board of the journal Socialist Commentary, which had been the organ of the non-communist German left exiles in Britain, welcomed Oxford lecturer Anthony Crosland, Alan Flanders, a former TUC official, and Rita Hindon, who had set up the Fabian Colonial Bureau. While AFL organizer Jay Lovestone recruited many of his agents from the former exiles around Socialist Commentary, this journal in its new setup became the mouthpiece of the right wing of the Labour Party and developed a close collaboration with the new leader, an anti-communist American magazine which from 1950 was sponsored by the CIA. Flanders, who was in the United States studying the American trade union movement, contributed anti-communist articles to both publications, while Dennis Healy, the future Labour minister, became London correspondent for the new leader in 1954. The TUC leadership not only played a critical role in splitting the WFTU, but also propagated the American methods of scientific management that its representatives had become fascinated by in the course of Washington-sponsored junkets. The ruling Labour Party, apart from playing a major part in shaping the institutional framework of Atlantic integration, complemented TUC activities on the European continent by supporting the pro-American split-offs in the European Social Democratic parties. On the other hand, rank-and-file labourist support from the Nenni majority socialists in Italy in 1948 was vigorously suppressed. And so I'm just going to stop quoting there. But a lot of people don't seem to realise that that was how it went. That there were two lefts and that one of them was suppressed and the other one was allowed to proceed.
When I think of the American model, I think of the virtues that the American founding fathers wanted, like something that was described by Charles Murray in his book "Coming Apart: The State of America" in 1960 to 2010. Just one is, if I remember the four virtues, one is communities, the religion. Third is honesty. The fourth is I'm trying. The fourth one is industrialist or whatever. Yeah, I think I named.
But these things are very ideal, very, very idealist sounding. But you can't just there was no way that they were going to be able to, after 1945, just come in and say, okay, we've got 4 new values for you to adopt, and this is what the West is, and then everyone should cooperate. They weren't going to do it unless there was some kind of payoff involved in terms of rising prosperity and rising living conditions. That was absolutely necessary. Without social democracy, it would not have been able to happen.
Also, on this book, Coming Apart, Charles Murray basically documented the slow disintegration of the American communities. He documented that. He basically said that the decline of social capital been happening since 1972. Like this includes less participation in local democracy, local election. Basically, he also, other thing, the kind of honesty. He said that American business communities are gathering a reputation for their dishonest business tactics. Yes, it's a very interesting book. I think people should read him. I like Charles Murray despite my more personal disagreements with him.
What does he claim that declining social capitalism is a consequence of?
Just basically, like, he doesn't really pinpoint the decline of social capital. Like, he doesn't really establish the cause of it. He just said these are just basically social patterns in the white communities in America. And like, he basically it more so focused on the social patterns in the lower white middle classes of it, essentially. He doesn't establish a cause, and I think he did that on purpose, so he doesn't attract any heat. But yeah. Also, I forgot marriage. I forgot marriage. Yeah.
Oh yes, I can imagine you would mention that.
Yeah, he also mentioned the decline of marriage. He said that also the decline of marriage, the rise of single motherhood. I think in the white communities is about 70, not 70%, but 30. It's rising. It's about 30%. Just these retrogressions are rather concerning. Many conservatives who read that book probably will blame it on the sexual revolution and the war on poverty or the Great Society programs. People like I know this is a typical Soul talking point because he will say that due to the war on poverty and affirmative action, that really set the Black communities set back for a decade. That's a typical Thomas Sowell conservative talking point there. And he also criticized the Europe, well, not exactly the European Social Organization, saying his main criticism of it is that I'm trying to remember, I haven't read it in a while, is that they'll eventually run out of money for their welfare states. And they also focus they're generally less productive because he documented that many Europeans will take more vacation days than work throughout the week. Just while Americans are more hard working, more productive.
Yeah, but I mean, so long as Europe continues to have real growth, right, and particularly so long as they manage to tie up these trade deals that they're engaged in, right? I mean, I think it is survivable. So I think that they're actually sounding the alarm far too early. The biggest threat that Europe really faces, if there's anything that's an existential threat, I would say it's actually two things: the problematic inability to define its own borders, first off, and second off, the crisis that has been unfolding since 2011,
What?
but which really picked up pace in 2014, which was obviously the refugee influx mismanagement crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Angela Merkel.
Yeah, I mean, if you really take a look at the difference between different states and their responses to this, China's response was really amazing. There's a quote from 29th of June 2017 where China published in well, someone published in China Global Times, two paragraphs. I'm just going to quote for you, and then just imagine if a German person had said this. Quote, the priority for China is still development. An excessive influx of refugees will have a huge impact on social order. If terrorists infiltrate China among the refugees, the safety of 1.4 billion people will be under threat, a fear that can be proved by the current European refugee crisis. Accepting too many refugees may deprive China of a stable environment for development. China is exploiting its development to stimulate the global economy and is actively offering public goods to the world through platforms such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. If China were to be mired in chaos, other countries and even the world would suffer the consequences. End quote.
Germany. I have very specific feelings about Germany itself because I ultimately feel bad for them. Honestly, they got screwed, really screwed. Uh,
It was a run of bad luck, wasn't it?
just I think it's part of a much more deeper cultural problem because they have a very. I think they're just taught. I think they're just taught to be shame of German culture, German basically being shamed to be German. Like, and
It's, it's also
I
It's
remember
also I would even go as far as perhaps to suggest that sometimes this stuff is not necessarily a shame or some kind of like self-loathing or something, but rather that this is an unintended consequence of the export of American ways of understanding the world. So, for instance, if I quote Michael Hayden, you'll realize where I'm going with this because Michael Hayden also had a thing that he wrote for the CIA back in 2010 in which he actually warned against the exact thing which ended up happening. So I'm just going to quickly read it to you. It's only about 4 paragraphs. So he says, we have to broaden our understanding. Let me tell you why, just beyond, you've got to speak the language if you're going to read the message you just intercepted. It's more important than that, because we have to guard against viewing the world exclusively through an American prism. We must not rely exclusively on American or even Western lenses in assessing foreign challenges and helping policymakers decide how to respond to challenges. Large parts of the world, and including some of those that I've already mentioned this afternoon, okay, do not share all of our ideas and values. Now look, we cherish and live our own values, but we must know and appreciate those of others. Their perception and behaviors are driven by motivations and experiences that are sometimes very different from our own, and we have to understand that. And keep in mind, this is a transcript, that's why it's got some of his in-between statements in there. Take, for example, the issue of ethnic nationalism. Here's an easy one, and it doesn't take much explaining. America has successfully assimilated new arrivals for hundreds of years. Our status, the melting pot thing, is a source of national pride and strength. Unless we are careful, though, now I'm talking about our analysts and academic thinkers, unless we're careful, though, that pride and experience in what we have done might create a blind spot for us. We could easily misunderstand or discount the potency of ethnic nationalism in other parts of the world, a mistake that could have serious implications for American security and policy. This was driven home to me several years ago now. I was in Pristina in Kosovo, and the NATO headquarters there is a place called Film City because it was a film studio during the heart of the war. And I'm there in Film City. I'm going to take a briefing from the intelligence scene that is there. And hold on, just going forward. And he goes on, so I'm just going to skip down a bit. So, and he continues, through the fact of global migration, this impact of rapid population growth in Africa or Southeast Asia and elsewhere is not going to be confined to those places. It will be felt in the developed world as well. Millions of young people from fast growing, poorly developed countries will emigrate, legally and illegally, in search of economic opportunity, security, or political freedom. Now, receiving countries, and America has a wondrous record in this regard, receiving countries, of course, will have much to gain from an influx of young workers, particularly because, in most developed states, populations are apparently aging rapidly. This social integration of immigrants will pose a significant challenge to many host nations. Again, that boosts the potential for unrest and extremism. Consider Europe. The fastest growing minority there is comprised of people who have emigrated from predominantly Muslim countries and their descendants. It's not that it's hard to get exact figures. Estimates vary, but most say there are about 5 million people of Muslim heritage in France, 3 million in Germany, and almost 2 million in the United Kingdom. Today, the total for the European Union is roughly 16 million, or about 3% of the population. 3% of the population. But with a birth rate at least twice the average of ethnic Europeans, the Muslim population will continue to grow as the non-Muslim population of these states actually shrinks in the next several decades. Now, even before 9/11, European governments recognized that this growing immigrant community posed challenges to their societies. Since then, they have put in place a variety of measures that aim to improve assimilation of these immigrants, counter extremism, but I think it's fair to say success has been mixed at best. I'll just stop quoting there. And so it's almost like he foreshadowed what was going to happen. And then Angela Merkel kind of came along and it got worse.
Hmm.
I think that if there's something wrong, I'd say that would be a problem which needs to be addressed. But on all these other social issues and stuff, where it's kind of like, I don't know, marriage and things like this, these are comparatively like not even, in my view, even on the radar. Because I think the Europeans get along just fine with the marriage rates or divorce rates, whatever you want to call them, that they're at right now. I think, like, is it the case in the United Kingdom, for example? I think it's something 40 something percent of children are born outside of a married couple. And that has not caused a spontaneous implosion of the country. What would cause a spontaneous implosion of the country, however, would be if you were to invite a lot of people into the country who don't agree with that. Because then you'd have a social problem, because then you'd have disagreement. If you had 100% complete uniform agreement on, for example, the idea that the presence of a father figure is not strictly required for social cohesion, then you would actually have social cohesion because of the fact that everyone would be in full agreement on this reality.
I think it's different in America.
It's the disagreement which is where many of these social problems erupt from. That's where your instability is found.
Like, but then again, you're kind of creating the foundations of a very weak society if this just becomes a norm.
Well, is it really weak, though? Think about it. If we come out and say that the presence of a father figure is not strictly required, what that means in real terms is that we're actually saying that it's okay that if you assess that the partner that you're with is not actually worth it, it's possible to shut that whole thing down before it develops into something really catastrophic, which will then involve social services. So how much money is saved by essentially incentivizing people to just cut things off, cut relationships off if they're going in a bad direction when they need to, rather than extending it past its due date and having basically to clean up the mess later.
Okay.
You ironically might end up paying more to clean up the mess of deliberately extending bad relationships than just having a social order in which people can just end it if it's bad.
All right, coming from my own personal life, personal experience, my mom told me is that I'm being raised by a single mother. She told me don't have any kids before you get married. I think she wanted someone to help her raising me and my brother-in-law, and just being. The thing about a father in American culture is it's sort of just a important. Well, it's important for child development to have a strong male figure in their lives. It either have to be a father or a compassionate, big someone who's male who's able to teach them stuff about life, that kind of wisdom. the reason why many conservatives are so worried about the black communities and its own problem with single motherhood, which is about 70%. I think in about 1995,
Oh,
uh, people, black families in poverty, the father wasn't present. It was about 85%. That's very concerning. It just seemed like
I suppose so, but I mean, one of the things that I mean, hear me out on this suggestion. If you said 85%, right?
yes, it's the
Yeah,
figure.
and so what are we seeing there in terms of like if you look at it from a purely from a free market perspective, it means that 85% of males in your community would rather walk than stay. That's their revealed preference, right?
That's
Okay. And so if that is their revealed preference, I would say that the most efficient thing to do would be rather than trying to come up with a system of governance that will somehow force them back into the scenario they didn't want to be in and then expect to get performance out of them while they're in that scenario, the better way of doing it would be to say, okay, what if you just empowered African American women both economically and politically and had them take over these roles instead?
uh, um, uh,
Because
uh,
it seems to me that American conservatives have this whole thing precisely backwards.
um,
If men are walking out of these situations already, why would you want to then take the males which they are actually suspicious of and reinstall them as the heads of families?
you're setting up a powder keg.
It'd be almost like, okay, well, I'll give another example. It'd be almost like if you had like a corporation, for example, and you had one particular, well, not one particular employee, a particular type of employee that is known to continually do embezzlement. It'd be almost as if conservatives came along and said, okay, one way to cure the embezzler of their embezzlement would be to place them in charge of all of the money.
It's uh, you're starting you're starting a powder keg. It's a thing that you just don't understand. You don't want to lift. You don't want to open this Pandora box. Please, please. I don't want to see that happen. No, 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 no.
No, would that not be better than what you have right now? Because what you have right now is I guess, you can correct me if I'm wrong, what you would have right now is essentially no leadership whatsoever, and one half of that thing which should be leadership abdicating. So if you just collated that power into the people who are actually present on the scene, why would that be a bad thing?
Just
Like
don't.
for example, your mother sounds like a very responsible person. Why would you not want to essentially confer the authority on her then, instead of having her wishing that someone else would come back and hold the authority?
You just don't understand. You don't understand how American black women function. I don't want. It just
Like, I mean, obviously, I don't have the what's the word for it? I don't have the up close personalized perspective. So all I can do is essentially do a transposition. But I mean, hypothetically, I mean, obviously I can speak for the Asian community. Hypothetically speaking, if you were to essentially take all authority and pool it into the hands of Asian women, I don't think the community would implode.
yeah. That's the thing that I can understand. Asian mothers seem to be rather. They seem to be very hierarchical, very structured, all that. But black women, they're they're a other beast to handle. Honestly,
Okay, these things you're referring to, which I won't make you specifically list, obviously, because sensitivity and all of that. But these things which you're probably thinking of, how many of these things do you suppose might be solved by a rise in net wealth?
just black women tend to be kind of insufferable. That's the thing. They tend to be mean, loud, kind of thing. Kind of thing. All those stereotypes are true. Like are true. They're a reason why black men kind of just don't like, what's the word? Ratchet women, ghetto rats, hood rats, that kind of thing. Those are like the worst kind of people to deal with. Those aggressive types.
No, I mean imagine giving them political power. However, wouldn't they be great fighters for your cause? if you believe that they are this way, of course I'm not obviously affirming that they're this way because I mean I can't say, right? But I mean hypothetically, let's say that you're correct about that. Would that not be an asset, depending on which context you placed it in?
It's just it's just
And also, wouldn't they have had to have learned this behavior from experience because of how difficult the situations they find themselves in are?
Yes, but I just there's a reason why many other races don't find the black woman to be that all that. Well, it's depending on personal preference, but from the thing I get, just like it's just not ideal. Just it
Well,
just
looks like I've just
you're
gotten you
just
in trouble with
playing
your own people.
you're just playing with fire. You're just playing with fire there, honestly. Just I
Well, I
just,
don't know. I don't know. I think I've just gotten you in trouble with your own people.
just the
Here
thing
you are being distant.
I shouldn't be telling you this. There's a thing in black community is don't air out dirty laundry. I probably should not be telling you this. Probably
Yeah,
just
I was thinking that.
so yeah, it's sort of like the thing. Is that the same thing in Asian communities too? So
Somewhat. Although occasionally I break that unspoken rule too. But
so
still,
so yeah, I just no, just this is it's just I don't want to live in that world. Don't put me in that ideal world. I want fathers to be back to be back in their children's lives. That's the thing. That's will honestly solve a lot of problems because before the sexual revolution, before the great societies, black families just were strong, kept very tight knit, and honestly, despite voting Democrat, black communities are very conservative. Like they're very socially.
yeah.
There's still strong homophobia in the communities, and just
Yeah,
that's
almost to a comedic level where you're thinking, is that for real?
yes, that's true. It's just that's there's still strong homophobia. It's probably due to the fact like I think black people, African Americans, like one of the most religious, the most it's one of the most religious demographics in America.
Yeah, it's a strong presence of Christianity.
I kind of just love that spirituality about that. Honestly, just just sort of just have that connect. You're sort of just connected. It's
Have you
sort
ever come across a view? Have you ever come across a view among them, which is that this was a religion that was given to them by someone else against their consent?
honest. Actually, yes. Like you have people like Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali
Yeah, yeah.
about that. Like
No,
yeah,
I mean, obviously they are historical figures, but I mean, in terms of like the climate that exists right now, particularly obviously in the era of Trump, where everything has kind of come to an extreme, where every kind of extreme has been accentuated. Have you begun to see more African American people talking about, sort of a full rejection of everything?
not really. Not the rejection of God or anything like that. Just seem like I don't know. It just seemed like looking to people like Oprah Winfrey or just looking back to rather important black figures that really helped to expose the problems of the black community. Like someone
Have
from
they not considered though how convenient it is that this God that they've been introduced to happens to rule against them so often?
I don't know, just
In the sense that how do you worship a God which was capable of being beneficent to your enemies consistently? Like the whole slavery thing, for example. I mean, they're the ones that came holding the Bible, right?
yeah, like the Bible is used to justify slavery, but it's just when black people when black preachers when slaves were able to when some slaves were able to become literate, people know how to read and actually read what the Bible say. They looked at stories saying that one comes to mind when Moses freed the Israelites, saying, "Let my people go." That kind of thing. I kind of get that feeling that black people are sort of the chosen people of God. It is often present in black communities to have that strong feeling, to knowing that you're special. That's you're special. They constructed this narrative that
Mm.
they're chosen people. That's kind of beautiful, honestly.
Yeah, but I mean, realistically speaking, though, the Bible actually claims that the Jewish people are his chosen ones, right?
Yeah, just Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. Just they were able to just mix that with their own going. They were able to apply these narratives from the Bible to their own lives and how they feel to basically uplift them, knowing that this
Oh,
like
I understand. They actually mapped the whole out of Egypt thing and all of that. They mapped that onto their own experience.
yeah, like they were able like coming being forced to being being kidnapped from your homeland, being sold as property to pick cotton or do whatever. Like I can see like it's sort of they sort of just connect the pieces to the story of Moses. There's a reason why Harriet Tubman was nicknamed Moses.
Oh,
Just is a very they were able to construct a narrative that was uplifting for them. That's the thing.
how
That's
did
why
they how do they assess the social justice elements that are inside the inside that book then as well? Because there are redistributive elements inside of that religion as well. You have to dig for them really, really hard to find them, but they're in there somewhere. For example, there's the one with the harvest, where what is it? Something about when you take up the harvest, you leave back the stuff that fell to the ground, which would seem to imply progressive taxation. Is that the view that they hold?
oh, a lot of them vote Democrat and a lot of them vote for wealth redistribution. Maybe that's the reconciliation in that.
Hmm. Well? I mean, since you're literally on the scene as well, what's the position of black churches on the rise of Donald Trump, for example?
Black churches.
From through your eyes.
Hmm. Black churches only. By the way, you probably should go to a black church someday in your life because they're very energetic. Just see, my church, the church I go to, is not very political in a sense. It's often, yeah. I would imagine they probably have a rise. They probably have opposition to Trump, partly because some of his rhetoric, some of the things he advocates for. Um, I think the general consensus in the black community is they just sort of just view Trump as just an ignorant person.
Okay, fair enough. So is in alignment with the way that the mainstream media has portrayed this. There's no nuance here that we're missing. It's,
Uh,
it's basically, Trump is bad. They have recognized he is bad, and that's basically it.
yeah, it's pretty much it. Some of them view him as a racist. Some of them just, it's, hmm, yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. One thing that's kind of get annoying is that black people are very ethnocentric. Just they don't like people. They don't like people like Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams. They they don't like they don't like him that much because they sort of just view them as Uncle Toms or like it's just sort of out the norm because they're right wing. They advocate for free market economics. They argue against the welfare state. They actually argue for the return of families. That's sort of the thing.
When you acknowledge that there's an element of self-interest in why they're upset with people like Thomas Sowell, given that if you enacted Thomas Sowell's policies, you'd probably end up with wage rises plateauing. I mean, I'm talking about real wages, so that includes, the amount, how far your money can go as well. You'd end up with that plateauing for that group of people because they are predominantly in the class of people that Sowell is actually not helping.
I don't know. There's a reason why
Because
people.
isn't it almost what is it 80 to 90 something percent of African Americans are actually in the working class? Is that the case?
I don't know the exact statistics, but that seems right.
Yeah, and so why it's not that outlandish that they would be against Thomas Sowell, given that his economics is not geared specifically toward helping working class people in the first place.
I don't know. Like there's
Like,
a
what's Sowell's position presently on unions, for example?
he doesn't really talk much about unions that much. Walter Williams, I
What's
think
his position on minimum wage?
he's against it.
There you go. And so obviously, it actually makes complete sense that the various ethnic minority groups would not like Thomas Sowell because they would be the people to watch that drop out from under them if he got his way.
Well, I think Walter Williams spoken out against unions. Like I remember it. Well, he wrote a book called South Africa Waged War Against Capitalism, and
Mhm.
he said that well, racist unions actually supported the minimum wage to different disenfranchised black workers. Um, like there's a famous quote by Walter Williams that you probably heard before that even during slavery, even during Jim Crow, that the black families community stayed together. But it was after the Civil Rights Acts that war on poverty really set them back. I'm just paraphrasing, but
Mm.
more
Has he
eloquent.
taken into consideration the reason this may happen is because when you're in a certain level of poverty, people don't have the ability to make the choices that might actually split family units up?
No, the thing is that he's saying that
Because it seems interesting that as soon as like is a family really actually together in the sense that it's really together if by injecting some money into it it instantly evaporates?
the thing is that black families' incomes were rising. They were moving up, but slowly. But it was progress
Mm.
before the Great Societies, before
Wait,
all
when?
stuff.
What year was this? What year was this?
Uh,
When he's the year he marks is the beginning of the Great Society, and when bad things by his metric happened in his view. What year
probably
was it?
after 1960, probably after 1964 when things started went downhill. I got one of Stoll books in my hand right now. Let me find chapter. Okay, and I quote the things I highlighted. Professor Herbert Gutman Monumental Treatise, The Black Family and Slavery and Freedom, 1750 and 1920, show that during the era from 1880 to 1925, the Tifro Afro family in the lower class status was headed by two parents. In 1923, 3% of black families in New York were headed by a woman under 30. The the unwrought teenage mother became common in later generation during the era of expanded welfare state. The reason for black poverty, often real black poverty in the earlier years, especially, were not hard to find. It was 1940 for the average black adult has 6 years of education, mostly in the inferior southern schools. In Georgia, the same year, half black adults population have reached the third grade. At the same time, 19% of black children of high school age in the South which actually went to high school. In 1924, the first public high school for black children in Atlanta was built after years of campaigns for such schools by local black communities. As of 1940, 87% of black families in the United States lived below the poverty line, but this declined to 47% by 1960. As black education and urban job experience increased in the rate of the mass migration of the blacks out of the South, this 40% point drop in black poverty occurred prior both to the civil rights laws and the war on poverty social welfare programs in the 1960s. Over the next 20 years, 1960 to 1980, black poverty dropped an additional 18 points. Significant, but continuation of pre-existing trends of a slower pace rather than being a new result from new civil rights laws and welfare state programs that often still claim. I think that's about enough.
Okay, can you give me that year again?
Uh,
Where it was continuing the trend but started to slow down.
I said 1964. That's
Okay, hold on one second. I'm just going to quickly check. 1964. Yeah, 1964 was just before. I'm looking at a graph here. World exports in current dollars from 1870 to 2011, and the source is authors based on Classing and Milionis 2012 for historical estimates from 1870 to 50, and the World Trade Organization from 1951 to 2011, and from Johnson and Nogueira 2012 for value-added exports estimates. So I'm going to give you the link to this afterwards anyway, so you can put this in the information. But when I look at this graph, I see 1964, and merchandise then begins to go up from there. Now, why is that happening? The reason that's happening is because re-globalization happened between 1964 and 1993, and then from 1993 to present is called hyper-globalization, which is when it kind of starts to go up like the end of a hockey stick. So what I would say is consider the idea that what's happening here is not that someone came in with the Great Society and then everything suddenly went badly for African Americans when everything was going well, but rather that an external force was responsible, quote unquote. An external force is responsible because more people outside of the United States could now also compete against the African American community for the jobs that African Americans wanted. So, for example, the Philippines competing against Detroit and things like this. This then meant that obviously wage gains for African Americans would slow down during that time period because that was when they were about to start slowing down for everyone. Does he take that into account in the book?
I'm afraid not. Yeah, I think it doesn't really contradict anything. So, yeah.
And so yeah, I'm saying that his figures are probably not wrong, the ones that you just read out to me, but I don't know that he's actually factoring in the idea that some of these jobs were being exported during that time. And so it's not like when they were looking around for basically like the quote unquote low wage labor, they could look anywhere in the world now. They didn't have to actually hire an African American person anymore because they could just send the job somewhere else. I'm not saying that's even a bad thing. That's just the nature of how global development works, right? And so I think it's misguided for him to look at that and not factor in these overseas developments and say, oh, well, it must be because Lyndon B. Johnson was a bad person or something like this.
Well, I'm more so. That's more my own talking points, but he did note that things were still improving, but at a much slower rate.
Also, what method is he using to calculate what the poverty rate is?
I think he relies on the. I think he usually relies on the Congressional Budget Office sometimes.
Yeah, I'm not certain whether they're using the poverty rate the way that it's supposed to be used as well, or at least the way that it ought to be used. Because if he's using this poverty rate, it's continually changing, isn't it? They've actually made it so that you can never actually get 0% poverty, right?
I could.
Because it continually adjusts, right? Because it's relative, right?
Right.
Or did he say absolute? Did he say relative poverty or absolute?
He does, unfortunately. So one of the criticisms of Sol is that he doesn't really define. He doesn't really have a methodology to use.
You see, this is the problem because I'm pretty sure that I've seen something on Forbes and elsewhere in which they described that the U.S. poverty rate after 1964 declined until it reached about zero.
That's kind of absurd.
It sounds like a ridiculous number, right? But I mean, if you think about it, is anyone in the United States really actually in complete grinding poverty?
No, they're always it's just a thing about American economy is it's very socially mobile. Yes, no one usually a lot of people may be in poverty in their life, but people are able to get out of it. God knows how.
Yeah, I'm trying to look for the thing now because I'm gonna read this out because I'm sure that your listeners, whoever are out there, are probably thinking that's because he started to go down after 1964 because obviously this contradicts everything that Sol would have said, right? Because Sol is probably claiming it went up, right? It stopped going down at the rate that it was going down at before.
The poverty?
I'm going to find it. Hold on.
I think he really say that poverty is going down. It's just much slower.
And so he's going to claim that the social services actually arrested the fall of poverty.
Well,
rather than helping it to go down.
He views the social services to be as a entry barrier, so to be something that slows down. He's a supply side economist, so he probably views things like social programs to be very counter that basically stagnate the production of wealth.
But think of it this way. While I'm getting to this, think of it this way: if something is so incredibly cheap to produce that social welfare systems inside the United States pay a person more than it would actually be paid to produce that thing, right? Wouldn't that job just be sent overseas anyway, where it belongs?
Like I don't
Like for
know
example,
how.
let's say you're manufacturing widgets, right? And the amount it's worth to pay someone to make this widget is something like, let's say, $2 an hour, right? Does that job really belong in the United States in the first place? Having
Nope.
having social welfare that, let's say, pays more than the amount that it would cost, sorry, more than the amount that you would have to pay that person to make that widget. It just means maybe that needs to be done in Laos or Cambodia, an economy that's in an earlier stage and is okay with doing that. Or maybe it needs to be automated.
Nope. Yeah. It's like I think for someone like Thomas Sowell, who is, well, like I said, a supply side economist, I think I think he missing some other factors, but I probably should look into that.
Also a possibility that I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. I've got an abstract. I've got the abstract. So the paper is called Winning the War, Poverty from Great Society to the Great Recession. I'm just going to read the abstract. Quote, we consider the long-run patterns of poverty in the United States from early 1960s to 2010. The results contradict previous studies that have argued that poverty has shown little improvement over time or that anti-poverty efforts have been ineffective. We find that moving from a traditional income-based measure of poverty to a consumption-based measure and, crucially, adjusting for bias in price indexes lead to the conclusion that the poverty rate declined by 26.4 percentage points between 1960 and 2010, 8.5 percentage points of which has occurred since 1980. Our consumption-based measure suggests considerably greater improvement than the income-based measures for single-parent families and the elderly, but relatively less for married parent families.
Yeah,
Changes in tax policy explain a substantial part of declining poverty. Social security has also been important, but other transfer programs have played a small role. Changes in education have also contributed, but other demographic trends have had little impact. Measurement error in income likely explains some of the most noticeable differences between changes in income poverty and consumption poverty, but saving and dissaving appear to play a modest role for most demographic groups. And so when you go across and you look at the poverty rate, and I'm looking at the consumption poverty rate, which I have on this graph, which I should give you afterwards, you can see it starts around 1964 at 32%, 32 point something percent. And then this line goes down sharply to about 15% at 1975, and then it extends across and gradually decreases until it touches about 1% in 2007.
So they cite the measure consumption than actual real income. Huh.
Yeah, they're using consumption poverty rate instead of the after-tax income or the official rate. The official rate, by the way, however it is they're measuring it, the official rate just doesn't move at all.
So
Which I'm not sure why that is. The official rate taken by the US government starts out at 20% in 1964, and then it goes down to 15%, and then it just undulates and continues at exactly around 15% right until the present day. It just doesn't move. Which suggests that something is wrong with that.
So use the income metric, the measure.
Yeah, the income metric is a red line they have on this graph, which starts at 33%, and it comes down to about 15% in 1975, and then it extends across and gradually goes down before bumping back up to around 20% in 1984, and then it continues back on down again until it touches in 2010 around 9%.
Interesting.
And that's for the entire country, not just for one population group. That's for the entirety of the United States.
What do you think of this? What do you think of this metric that they're using? Do you think it's a good way to measure poverty or income?
I think the consumption one might be the best rate to measure it with, and I think the reason for that, and I could be wrong about this again, so I'm open to critique, but I think the reason for this is because the consumption poverty rate allows you to take into account the fact that sometimes you can be holding the same amount of money, but products became cheaper.
Yeah, that's the thing. Just I don't know. I think the problem with that is that they're measuring consumer goods, but I think income actually matters more what you're consuming now, because income can matter a lot than things becoming more cheap over time. The thing is
Yeah,
that
yeah, I'll give you that. The gap between the two results at the end, where one of them is about three, but where the consumption poverty rate is around 2 or 3%, whereas the after-tax income poverty rate is somewhere around 9%. That's still like that's a it's close, right? The difference between 3 and 9, I guess, is a gap between there. But the official rate is the one that's absolutely ridiculous, where it's often like 17% or something like that.
yeah.
And that's the one the US government uses. The official rate the US government uses is their claim is something like 17 or 18% or something like this.
Eh, and
Which I think it's those numbers that Thomas Sowell is uncritically using, the ones that are just really high.
yeah, he often used government statistics.
And which I always think is paradoxical, right? Because if they don't trust the government to come up with these calculations correctly, why do they insist on using its statistics?
Well,
Because obviously the US government is going to come out and claim, well, we haven't accomplished any of our tasks at all. Let's do it harder.
let's see. I guess given the mentality is that, hey, government statistic is probably really high quality. Let's use that.
Hmm. Which is not always the case, because sometimes you have to understand. Sometimes you have to think about why did they choose to work it out the way that they worked it out, because there can be a self-serving element for a government bureaucrat in that. I'm almost going to sound like one of you libertarians now when I say this, but will a bureaucrat put himself out of business?
I think so.
Like, which bureaucrat is going to come out and declare, oh, we actually got poverty down to 3%? What would be the point of him being there anymore? And so I think that there is a kind of well, I mean, it's a possible. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, it's possible the reason that the official rate looks as weird as it does is possibly because someone is invested in not letting that number go down.
Also, have you ever heard the story why Soul quit Marxism? Or
No, I've never heard that story.
he was a Marxist, right?
Yeah, I did know that he was a Marxist before, but I'd never heard the story of what made him quit.
Okay. Soul was ironically or unironically, I don't know which, was a government bureaucrat. He used to work for the government. Then, whoever his bureaucracy was working for decided to conduct a minimum wage study, and I think you should watch the video because, from my memory, is that he was able to figure out this one problem, and all the bureaucrats thought he was insane because he was inadvertently taking away their job opportunities, the raise of their income due to the discovery.
Oh.
Then he realized government is not the answer, but the free market is, that kind of thing.
So his experience, Sowell's experience, was in the exact thing that should have made him not use those statistics then.
Yeah.
This is irony, right?
Yeah, just irony. I wish academic was here right now. I don't know. I like Thomas Sowell. He's a pretty decent economist from my understanding. He's not overrated. I think he just get cited way too much, honestly.
Yeah. Also the kind of people that tend to use him as their go-to. Because there's a lot of people who, as soon as you enter into a conversation with, the first thing they'll be like, well, as Thomas Sowell said, and you want to just kill yourself or something.
The thing is, they don't use his arguments. Use his arguments. I try to use his arguments without citing the man himself. Like, the reason why I keep using production as one of my talking points in this stream. Like, just use his arguments. Don't cite the man. Like, if you're using the man to back up your argument, then you're not confident in your own arguments because you're using
it's the appeal to authority thing.
Yeah.
That's my view as well. I'm okay with people obviously, taking someone else's arguments and utilizing it. But if they keep doing this thing where it's like, well, Thomas Sowell said this, then eventually after like the 15th time, you're just like, come on.
Oh, right.
I think we both know a person who does that consistently.
A certain English teacher.
Yeah, a certain English teacher keeps doing that.
Also, what's your thoughts on John Bolton, the new NAT security advisor?
Oh my gosh. John Bolton, what could even be said of him? He is one of the most uncouth attempts to have someone imitate a diplomat that I've ever seen. Like,
Yeah,
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous.
yes. Do you agree with him with Iran because he seems extraordinarily hawkish when it comes to Iran?
No, of course not. I mean, this idea of what he's doing with Iran is completely ridiculous. The purpose of actually courting Iran in the way that people had tried to do with the Iran deal and so on was to attempt to initiate a sequence of events which would cause the Iranian economy to become more integrated with that of the European Union. This would create two effects simultaneously. The first effect is that it would move Iran, or at least incentivize Iran, to split its allegiance between Russia and the West. Yeah, because obviously economic power, political power, these things are interlocked. So if you trade with someone for long enough, you become more intertwined with that person. Don't have Iran relying solely on Russia for most of its outside attention, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is it gives Europe the ability to engage in independent policy making when it comes to the issue of natural gas. Why? Because previously, natural gas has always been about politics. People are trying to pretend today that it's not, but it still is. So when you bring Iran online and you allow it to engage in trading natural gas with the European Union, it means the European Union now has the ability to not rely solely on Russia for much of that supply.
So, so, so
That
that
that was the purpose behind the United States, or I should say, the previous administration's purpose behind moving the United States into signing the JCPOA deal in the first place.
so that's why the European Union has that's why the European Union had that very strong reaction from the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran deal.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
that's why
Because
that's why this
because the withdrawal
find
from the Iran deal benefits Russia.
So that's why people the people on Twitter, the Hulks. I think they get it wrong. I think they really do get it wrong because they're looking at it from an American perspective or looking at it from a Zionist perspective on.
Mm,
I probably should have said Zionist.
yes. Well, I mean, you've said it already, so it is out there. But yes, there's also that because I mean, it's not even controversial to say that now anyway. Because very recently there was an article written in Haaretz where they detailed the fact that Netanyahu, on the anniversary of, which anniversary is it now? Is it the 71st anniversary since the end of World War II? This thing that Russia does, that parade that they have, that no one wants to go to because it's absolutely horrendous. But either which way, they had that parade thing, and this time Benjamin Netanyahu decided to go and meet with Putin, and they secured a little guarantee between each other that they would protect each other's interests with regard to this Iran thing. So, I mean, they've had the conversation. So, I mean, what you're saying there is not even speculative at this point. There is a connection between these
Oh, I
things.
just don't want to be called an anti-Semite by
Oh, don't worry. I'm sure you won't be. It would be unreasonable for someone to draw that kind of conclusion from what you just said. But yes, there is an alignment between Israeli interests, Russian interests, and the interests of Donald J. Trump and John Bolton and friends with regards to why they're doing what they're doing with Iran. And so, yes, the beneficiaries from that scenario would in fact be Russia. Russia. Um,
what's Israel gained from this breaking up of the deal? It seemed like they put in themselves in danger.
oh no, the same thing as usual, which is that they would like to see the crescent of not what's it called, the something of resistance. What are they called again? Axis of resistance. That's what it's called, which extends from Iran through Lebanon into Yemen and stuff like that.
Wait, isn't it the axis of evil?
No, axis of resistance is what the Iranians call their own
Oh,
array of Shia forces across the Middle East, right? And so what Israel would like to see is a breakup or a weakening of that axis of resistance. And so that's why they're able to have this weird relationship they presently have, where they're kind of with the United States, but also in constant negotiations with Russia, because they want to see if they can maneuver themselves into a position where they can get most of their policy objectives without upsetting either of those two great powers.
I think they're gonna upset one of these two great powers.
Yeah, probably.
Probably. Actually, it's probably gonna be Russia. The United States is just. Yeah.
The other thing about it also is that China has a stake in this as well, although that stake has not been expressed very forcefully as of yet. But China's big stake in this also is that much of its oil comes from the Middle East presently, and so if everything goes off the rails and you end up with an actual conflict between forces aligned to the United States and Iran, for example, the first person to feel the blow would in fact be China,
Mm.
followed by the United States itself, which would of course then suffer the second most out of all of this, because China would suffer the most, and East Asian economies connected to China would suffer the most. But the United States would also suffer the second most out of that, and also Afghanistan would suffer because of the fact that America's commitment to Afghanistan would be impacted by some kind of off the rails slide into a conflict, and anyone relying on oil imports or any kind of energy import would also suffer greatly because prices would increase. And then of course, which economy do we know of that profits greatly from energy prices going up? Well, we know the answer to that question: Saudi Arabia and Russia.
Yeah.
And so who will be making bank? Vladimir Putin would enjoy this all the way to the bank and back, as would Mohammed bin Salman.
So will we? Okay, if this implodes, well, it seems like a powder keg ready to explode anyway. But are we looking at a similar energy crisis back in the 1970s?
Yes, maybe. I mean, it's you know, there's more diversity of sourcing, and I guess so perhaps it won't be quite as bad as that. But I don't know. Actually, it really depends. It really depends on just how far it goes. There's too many variables involved. It'll be really bad, but I'm not sure whether I'd be able to compare it to what happened in the 70s.
Why do we elect stupid people?
Yeah, that is the big question. That is really like the $64 million question. Why did they have to go and elect stupid people?
Why? Just I don't know. Honestly, I like to just
No, go on.
I don't know. I like to see you debate someone who's actually like I don't know, who actually is like a pure hobby and libertarian. Like, that'd be like an interesting debate to see.
Well, we should have more of these because this was pretty good.
Yeah.
For a first one. This is the first time I've done this, right? Or is this the second time?
This is the first time we talk individually on there.
Okay, yeah. So this is pretty good then. I wonder if there's any Trump supporters in the audience kind of grinding their teeth in my general direction when we're coming down to the end now.
I don't think I draw Trump supporters. I think I just draw just right-wing libertarians, paleo-libertarians, and some anarchists. That's that's the thing. That's the crowd I usually draw.
All right. Well, we could we could do another one soon as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, sometime in next week, or maybe even tomorrow, depending on which.
Yeah.
I mean, this was pretty good. There are obviously a whole bunch of talking points that I have in front of me that I still haven't actually used, but they were not necessary yet. So it really depends.
Yeah.
So anyway, I would say anyways to the 5 Trump supporters who are probably listening, like grinding their teeth as usual. What can we say? What can I say about I guess you could say the role of the Asian diaspora in globalization? The globalization which is going to happen anyway. It's going to happen regardless of how hard Trump supporters decide to fight this, because they're only one country and there's the rest of us not having this, right? And so I think it's kind of like fate has made us a vanguard of global economic forces that almost appears to be beyond anyone's control. But it's a role we've decided to embrace. And I totally understand why cronies from legacy industries and legacy power blocks are so upset. It feels like there's a rush of water coming to the land. All of a sudden, you're not living on dry land anymore. You're living in the ocean. I totally understand that. But hey, times change. The era is changing, and this was almost inevitable. Asian development has brought you great food and a better economy, as well as the provision of great public goods. So what is there to complain about? In the British East Midlands, I feel like I'm fully at home. And do you know why? It's because the East Midlands is actually caught in between Europe and Asia. And for myself, as a third culture kid, I too am caught between Europe and Asia.
Shouldn't you be in Turkey then?
Shouldn't I be in Turkey? That's one way of putting it. Turkey will never be allowed to join the European Union, by the way.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna be in the stream here. I hope everybody has a good night and good weekend. Peace out.